afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to invite all of you, and especially my students who are back essentially from a vacation, because this is the current academic year. By virtue of reality, should have started by this last week. So it's a pleasure to have all of you back. And I see a large number of students who are now working in think tanks joining this time. That's an honor for the center, because it's good to have the alumni back for academic engagement. I also would like to welcome other faculty as well as some other people who have joined from various think tanks. And of course, a warm welcome to Dr. Mitter for having taken your time out, and definitely, with compromising on your time zones issues, that you have agreed to talk to us. It's indeed a great pleasure. And I must thank Alka for going ahead and pursuing this academic outing. And Alka, I would like you to take over and host this thing while I administer the technology front in admitting people. And I would also like to ask my students to sort of post your questions on a chat format so that it becomes easier for us to handle the discussion session. Over to you, Alka, for a good introduction of Dr. Mitter and thereof.
Okay, thanks, Shabani. I am slightly technologically also a bit challenged. So maybe once the Q&A starts, you could help me out. I don't think I'll be able to deal with it very efficiently. Okay, so let's start. This is the new. Well, are we technically in the new semester now?
I presume.
I don't know. I mean, well, we never had a vacation. We never had a break. I mean, this whole thing has been it's been completely bizarre. Yeah. So in any case, what we thought is normally this is the time that the new semester begins in normal circumstances. So we thought we would kickstart our seminar, our monthly seminar series of the department. And much of the discussions that we had to now were about, the usual bring people in and get them to talk, scholars, academics, policy makers, and so on. But the backstory here is the China-India crisis. And what we've been seeing is a surfeit of webinars, all of them very, very actively focused on the here and now, discussing, dissecting statements, difference in a very present kind of a situation, and happening from day to day. It's very easy. So you have the news on the one side, which is quickly swamping us with developments in quick time. And in that kind of a context, it becomes very easy to lose sense of the fact that we are, after all, a bunch of people who are trying to study China. And what are really the kind of things we should be having in mind as we develop our understanding about China. And in that kind of a context, of course, I sent out that short note, which seemed to be an opposite theme against the backdrop of the IR debates and the whole question about the old order changes. Is the new one in? Who's going to lead the new order? So it's really a lot of things, but all these themes and all these strands were leading me to one issue, which is how easy it is to forget the historical context, and how easy it is to forget that it is really history which provides us with a lot of depth in understanding what is happening, grasping that sense of history. In Rana's own words, I would say that's really what triggered off, which is that that if you want to understand China today, we must look at the past. And so I really immediately thought of inviting him to kickstart these series, which would focus on leadership. That's really the point at which we started, but then start looking at the kind of historical issues that are bound up with West. I mean, leaders are not just born in a vacuum and they don't take over and start addressing the issues of the day. There is a certain kind of a context, a social, a political, a cultural, a historical context in which these leaders are operating and moving on. So those are the two kind of currents which led me to Rana Mitter, and I'm very, very glad that he responded with such alacrity. We also decided that we would introduce the speaker through two of writing which the students would read and come, which would help them also understand and contextualize the speaker's arguments. And I'm sure that students today are much more savvy, and therefore they would have really gone on the net and seen. So I'm not going to spend too much time about the background. He's center through his writings. He's a professor of history and politics of modern China, and he's the director of the University of the Oxford China Center. So authored many books, many, I must confess, I've not read all, but whatever I've read with enormous pleasure to begin with. He does very well, and then with considerable instruction as well. Rana, I must say that my favorite is still the Manchurian Myth. I love the way you took us through that whole narrative. But that's really what also we are hoping that after your talk today, our students would really go back to connect with that history, the importance of history. And so with those words, I would like you to just take over and start your topic.
Alka, thank you very much indeed for those kind words. And let me start briefly before I begin my talk, if I may, by thanking Professor Acharya for her very generous invitation, her reputation both at the Institute for Chinese Studies in Delhi, which I've visited with pleasure in the past, and also, of course, now JNU goes before her, along with many very distinguished names I see on the list. I won't name every single one of them. I'll take up most of the time for the talk, but I'm very conscious that both in terms of faculty and student audience, we have some very expert and very distinguished people on the call, so I'll have to try and keep myself up to the mark. I'll also say something briefly, if I may, by way of advertisement, if you'll let me slip that in, Alka, which is your instructions to me, which I'm following very rigorously, I should say, is that this is not a discussion about the Sino-Indian War of 1962 or about the Galwan crisis. However, if anyone would like to take part in a conversation, which I'll be in on that subject, this Saturday coming up, the 25th of July, I'll be speaking via Zoom at the Jaipur Literary Festival Brave New World, which is available for free through YouTube, and it'll be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. I'll be in conversation with the British writer and historian of India, Dalrymple. So if you want to come in on 6-2, then it might be a good opportunity to do it, just to let you know, and I'd look forward to seeing you there if you're part of that.
Thanks for that. It would be very, very interesting to hear that. Dalrymple and you would really make a great combination.
All on the Jaipur Literary Festival website if you want to check in. As I say, my understanding is it's free to air. You just go on YouTube and it's right there, either live or recorded later for your interest. But today I'm not going to be talking about those subjects, and as Professor Acharya has asked for, I'm going to make a brief series of points. I'm going to try and keep them quite focused within the next 25-30 minutes or so. First, to allow time for discussion and questioning, and I hope we will do that. And secondly, to focus actually on the specific topic that I was very glad you brought up just then, of leadership, which I think is very much where the focus of the series lies, as I understand it. And I think that leadership is obviously important in any society, but I wanted in particular to look at two contrasting figures at the heart in historical terms, one of which is Confucius, one of which is Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, both of whom will be well known to this audience, both of whom, in a sense, are more than the sum of their parts. They are bigger figures than just their lifetimes, because in some ways, they summarize two sets of attitudes or ideas that have existed within China about what leadership is. And because these two figures in some ways were in high contrast, I want to end my comments by talking about perhaps somewhat unexpected ways in which these two historical figures and their styles of leadership, if you want to put it that way, have come together in some rather unexpected manners. Those of you who are students of Marxism, and I have to say these days, I sometimes get the impression there are more Marxists in India than there are in China, but they seem to have gone for all-out capitalism in a way that I'm sure Marx would not have approved of. All those who are students of Marxism will know that the process of dialectic, and that one has a thesis, an antithesis, and coming to a synthesis through the means of working out contradictions, is something that I think is still very, very central in the minds of Chinese decision makers and leaders. And thinking about Confucius versus Mao, but also Confucius combined with Mao, I think is a powerful way to try and use that combination of ideas, which in some ways sit much more naturally in the mind of someone who has grown up in China's political system. Because even if the economic system is capitalist, even if China is open to the world, I think we underestimate sometimes the importance of both of these thought systems, the long tradition of Chinese political and philosophical thinking underpinned by Confucius and others, and the Marxist-Leninist dialectic, which actually, because it's not talked about so much in English these days in China, as opposed to internal conversations in Chinese, outsiders can make the mistake of ignoring. And I think to ignore it even today is a mistake. And I'll go on to explain exactly why. But to do that, I'm going to have to hope the technology will let me share my screen. So now is the moment of truth. Okay, let's try that. Okay, so are we getting screen?
Yes.
Okay, so can everyone see the screen saying conflict to Confucius? Okay, please do jump in someone if the screen disappears or anything happens to interrupt that, but for now it looks like it's going to come together. So I want to start, if I may, with the figure of Confucius. And again, to this audience, I'm sure that there will be a certain amount of familiarity. So I won't do the very, very basic elements. You know, I'm sure you know the basics of who he was, living in that period in the 6th century BCE, someone who, of course, was a Chinese philosopher, teacher, and thinker with only a moderate level of success in his own lifetime. But from the Han Dynasty onwards, came to be essentially the ethical underpinning of something like 2 millennia of Chinese thought. But I think it is worth bringing up the question of why the thinking and philosophy of Confucius, in particular, should have become so embedded in that very long imperial tradition of governance and rule, and try and work out what you might call the kind of defining elements of that thinking. So Confucius himself famously came to prominence, quite limited prominence in his own lifetime, but prominence amongst his disciples, certainly, because he was engaging with a period of great political turbulence. He was living and working during the period of the spring and autumn period, as it was called, a period essentially of internally warring and conflicting states. And it's from that situation, rather as Machiavelli or other political thinkers reacted to the turbulence of their own time in later years, that he came up with the precepts that we now associate with a codified form of his thinking, in which we have that very kind of to describe. And I think some of those elements have become very well known. The idea that an ideal society is harmonious, the idea that reciprocal relationships of a benevolent nature are important. You know, the so-called golden rule of do unto others what you would want done to yourself, and vice versa. The importance, of course, of education, which remains to this day a very strong Chinese precept and is linked, I think, strongly to the very, very dedicated way in which the written word is given a pretty much sacred status for a very early period in Chinese history, in a way that is different perhaps from some other early societies parallel to it. The importance, though, also of some, I mean, all of these elements I mentioned so far, in some senses, seem quite modern. We're all keen on harmonious societies. We're all keen these days on education. But some of the other elements do sit more uncomfortably in the present day. Confucianism then and now insists that certain types of hierarchy are important and necessary for the fabric of society. And in an age of equality, in an age in which political identity is based very much on the idea that we should all have equal standing in some absolute sense, that is, of course, in its pure form, a very non-Confucian idea and creates a certain amount of dissonance in terms of the way in which it can be operationalized, politically speaking. In addition, there's one particular term, and again, I know there are many Chinese speakers amongst the audience here, so you will recognize this, but just to say it for a moment, the idea of li, as it's known, the idea of what's usually translated as ritual as a central part of what Confucian thinking is, I think, something that certainly in Western modern societies is less familiar. I think perhaps it's more familiar in non-Western modern societies. Japan would be an example of this, by which I mean the English language translation ritual, I always think is very inadequate to explain the Confucian idea of li. Ritual in English, as you know, has a religious element, which I think is not relevant here. It has a rather sort of schoolroom feel, like a sort of Victorian exercise book, something of that sort. And again, the idea of li in the Confucian ethic and way of thinking is actually a very dynamic and very productive way of working within society. At its most simple, it's about doing the right thing in the right way. And one of the things that always, I think, amuses outsiders, including, I know, many Indians, when they meet Chinese friends, is that quite often agendas, policies, plans on the Chinese part are always numbered. We always have, like, you know, the 4 great ideas, or the 6 prohibitions, or the 9 ways of moving forward. And this has a rather quaint air in English, certainly, but it is, of course, an expression, I think, of that idea very, very much tied to Confucian ideas of order in society and hierarchy, and li, doing things in the right way, that one should have a plan in which various elements come together in the right sort of. So some of these elements clearly are more idea of Confucius than others, but I think they all come together in ways that are actually refracted quite visibly in the modern Chinese mindset, if you know where to look. And of course, in Confucius's own day, and in the many hundreds of years that followed, 2000 or so, it's worth noting that hierarchy became embedded in very, I think, destructive ways. The gendered hierarchies, which were always very central to Confucian thinking, the inappropriateness, for instance, of a woman ever becoming emperor, was very central to Chinese imperial thinking. And as a result, only one woman, the Tang Emperor Wu Zetian, became an emperor in her own right during the medieval period in China. Also, of course, the hierarchies of master to servant, husband to wife, and so forth. These are things that any modern society, including China itself, no longer finds compatible or comfortable in those terms. But it's worth thinking about the origins of those particular ideas in terms of a very strong network of social assumptions and things. Because there's something else that I think distinguishes this type of thinking that needs to be put into contrast with something else. So let me explain what I mean by that. Whatever else you might say about Confucian thinking, and also the thinking of the many ancient philosophers who in some ways stand in contrast to Confucius, but also in conversation with him. Han Feizi, someone much more hardline in his understanding of human nature. And Confucius basically thinks human beings are good, but can be corrupted and have to be put on the right path. Han Feizi thinks, no, they are fundamentally evil and need to be corrected. Xunzi, in some ways, takes a similar view. But all of these exist as part of a broadly indigenous Chinese tradition of philosophical thinking that emerges in that period from, say, 800 BCE to about 200, 100 or so forth over a half millennium period. And this, I think, gives sometimes the often very misleading view, and I think it is misleading, that Chinese thinking is therefore only drawn from what you might call culturally Chinese traditions. And of course, that tradition is very important. Without Confucius, without Mencius, without Xunzi, without Han Feizi, you would not have a Chinese philosophical tradition. But you also wouldn't have what I think we have to think of as the complete understanding of Chinese tradition if we didn't have external influences too. And I like to sort of show this picture because, in fact, of course, it is a sort of, it's slightly misleading. And if you, those of you who read Chinese will see why. Confucianism is often called, as it were, a sort of Chinese DNA, a kind of central defining set of characteristics. But I put a question mark after that because, of course, what you see here is a Buddhist temple. And Buddhism, I think, is one of the best examples of an early phase, and it's not the only one, but an early phase of the cultural hybridity, which also, I think, to me, fundamentally shapes the idea of Chinese political, ethical, and social thinking. It's often said, not least today, by Chinese friends and interlocutors who often want to put Westerners on the back foot, that China, of course, unlike anywhere else, has 5,000 years of continuous history. The number keeps on increasing year by year. At one point, it was 3,000, and then over the years, it became 4,000 and 5,000. So it may be increasing. But of course, for me, the obvious answer is, well, that's absolutely true in many senses. But that so-called Chinese culture wouldn't have been Chinese without the influence of Central Asia, of India, of the Mongols, of the Manchus, and a whole variety of other people who are not automatically considered to be indigenous Chinese. And that, of course, is the great joy of Chinese culture, just as it is, of course, in a different way of Indian culture and many other places too, that one narrow nationalistic definition of what this term means is never sufficient. So Buddhism is, I think, a very good counterexample. It arrives, as many of you will know, in what we think of as China in about 100 CE or AD. It emerges through Central Asia. The great monk, known by his Pali Sanskrit name of Kumarajiva, but actually Central Asian by background, does then the great job 150, 200 years later, of translating into what become 2 million Chinese characters, many of the most important Buddhist texts, some of which are still chanted to this day in the major Buddhist temples of India, and I think of China. And I think one of the things that is most interesting, both about the progress of Buddhism and about the cultural hybridity of China, is that today there are millions and millions and millions of Buddhists worshipping in China, whereas of course the number of Buddhists in India is much more restricted today, even though it's the point of origin. The other point is that Chinese Buddhism over that period is both entirely recognizable as Buddhism, as something that comes from somewhere way outside China's culture, and yet has been indigenized and hybridized in a way that is absolutely indistinguishably Chinese, as this temple and its pagodas show, as the characters show. But even that character on the right hand side, you can see in the picture there, 4, which of course is Chinese for the Buddha, referring particularly to the Amida Buddha, is actually a transliteration of a Sanskrit term, Pali, I should say, strictly speaking, I think. And in this particular case was an example of how that drawing in of cultural influences from elsewhere has then, as now, I think always been a tremendously important point in terms of understanding China's cultural mix. And that, I think, is very relevant for all sorts of debates going on in China today about what is the nation state, what is the role of national minorities, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and so forth, which of course has become highly contentious for reasons that you will recognize extremely knowledgeably, I'm sure. So those elements, I think, sort of provide some element of background to the first point that I want to make, which is that there are leadership figures in terms of ethics, political thinking, and Confucius is the example I use because he's so well known and so central, but he's by no means the only one. But that all of these figures sit in a mixture of profoundly hybrid culture in which, in a phrase I like to use, and I'll use it now, it's very clear that China is a plural noun. It is not one society, one culture, one language, or one tradition. It consists of a great many. And sometimes when we have in China, as we do in India and Britain and other places, an often very monolithic view of what a so-called national culture is, it's worth noting that history proves something, I think, quite different. And the leaders who have done best, I think, in terms of their legacy carrying through in China, are those who I think have drawn on those other traditions. Let me use that thought then to fast forward us very, very, very fast about 2,000 years to the beginning of the 20th century, which is where I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so before we end up with the present day. And I'd like to move forward to an event on which I've written in one of my books, which Alka was kind enough to mention. Actually, this is a different book. It's called A Bitter Revolution, and it's about the legacy of this particular historical incident. Many here will know, but I will summarize very briefly, if I may, for those who perhaps don't, that in the year 1919, there was a profoundly important political moment felt more years on in today, called May 4th movement. It's named after the 4th of May 1919, and the very specific circumstances, as many of you will know, was that China having China having contributed many workers on the Allied side to World War I in Europe, was then essentially double-crossed by the Japanese, the British, the French, and the Americans at the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, at the end of World War I. Territories which had previously belonged to Germany were not handed back to the Chinese government, but instead were taken over by the Japanese for a period. And this led many of the youthful scholars of China, particularly in Beijing, to gather about 3,000 of them in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, the Tiananmen, which then as now sits in the center of Beijing, the front of the Forbidden City, and protest against what they saw as the weakness of China being pushed around by other imperial powers. The last emperor had been overthrown in a revolution just 8 years before, but the ending of the imperial dynasty had not solved the fundamental weakness of China, which its youth saw had begun really with the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century and were beginning to accelerate, with both sort of warlord splits that were dividing China up internally and continued efforts by foreign powers to maintain imperial control in China over issues such as customs, trade, tariffs, personal, political, legal immunity from the Chinese authorities and so forth. And this one demonstration of 3,000 students in May 1919 so-called new aspects to becomes relevant to our theme today for a couple of reasons. One is that it's, I think, the single moment in China's history, and we can now think of it as a moment. It lasted perhaps for more than half a century, but it is nonetheless an important period, when Chinese thinkers, the most radical thinkers, either sidelined or actively rejected Confucius. So from a figure who had essentially underpinned Chinese thinking with those ideas of ethics, harmony, hierarchy, ritual, and so forth for 2,000 plus years, the new iconoclastic generation that circled around that May 4th movement in Beijing, Shanghai, and elsewhere in the 20th century, Confucius was the problem, that he was the feudal figure holding China back, and that if China wanted to progress, it would have to reject Confucius and instead embrace two characters known as Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy. And that phrase, 在先生, De 先生, Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy, remains a catchphrase still understood, I think, by any well-educated Chinese even today. 100 years later, it became a very important sort of buzzword at the time. And in response to the rejection of what was felt to be the dead hand of Confucius on Chinese politics and thinking, many young thinkers at the time looked in other directions. The great writer Lu Xun, who's since become recognized perhaps as China's single greatest modern prose writer, argued or wrote a short story in which he equated Confucianism with cannibalism, a society destroying its young by eating its own flesh. And of course, a young man, then just a lowly library assistant at Peking University, who'd come up from the countryside in Hunan province named Mao Zedong, was one of those young people inspired by this period of radical iconoclasm and turned away from Confucius instead towards Marxism, with the results that, of course, we have come to know over quite a long period of time. I'll skip over the middle of the 20th century. I mean, again, many great events take place during that period, including, of course, the Titanic war against the Japanese during World War II, which essentially shatters the tentative modernization that existed during that period and set the stage for the eventual 1949 revolution, which brought Mao to power. He had grown older, his party had grown more powerful. There were a great many political dynamics from the Long March to the Second World War, which brought the communists from being a very kind of marginal, small-scale, urban outfit to being essentially a machine of millions of men and women who would come on to rule China. But one of the characteristics of Mao's period in power from 1949 to 1976 was that, particularly during the height of the Cultural Revolution between 1966 and 76, one of the targets continued to be essentially the obsession he had picked up in that period in 1919, 1920, and carried on into his middle and old age, which was the obsession with destroying Confucius and his legacy. So here's Mao dressed as a Red Guard in Tiananmen Square during the Cultural Revolution, which he's wearing that, you can't see it's black and white, but the green uniform of a Hongwei being a Red Guard. Here is, of course, a picture of him in his full cult of personality mode, with all the young Red Guards all around him in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. And the point is, of course, that he was setting himself up as a sort of leader who, in many senses, was the diametrical opposite of every single thing that Confucius had been traditionally associated with. So Confucius was about hierarchy, and Mao's Cultural Revolution was about knocking down every single hierarchy you could possibly imagine. In other words, letting the youth of China rise up against their elders, as they're doing. One particular elder, Mao, is preserved, but the rest are all being forced to confess their crimes. Whereas Confucius talks about the importance of education, Mao's Cultural Revolution talks about it's much more important to be read, ideologically pure, than it is to be expert, and all the universities get shut down in China for most of that period. Where Confucius is talking about the importance of understanding and preserving old culture and rituals and traditions, Mao launches a cultural revolution of which one of the top targets is the destruction, the smashing of old culture. And of course, it happens in a very literal way, with thousands of temples and relics and museums all being destroyed, as well, of course, as the lives of many millions of people who either die or who either are killed or driven to suicide during that period. And the anti-Confucius campaign becomes explicit during this period, particularly after 1972, when this campaign, which is part of an attack on the then Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, who was regarded as the new Confucius by the radicals in the communist leadership. This is a comic book which is basically from 1974, telling, as it says, the working people's struggle against Confucius. So at this stage, you have essentially someone who has raised himself up with a cult of personality that aims to destroy every single last legacy of Confucianism. And you might say that the height of the Cultural Revolution is perhaps the single most anti-Confucian period in terms of style of politics, leadership, and society at any moment in Chinese history. But I say that that's the height because that's nearly 50 years ago now. And slowly but surely, particularly after Mao dies, Deng Xiaoping becomes paramount leader of China in the late 1970s, and China begins slowly to open to the world and reject the Cultural Revolution, that the fall of Confucius becomes once again a rise. And to explain how that brings us up to the present day, let me just remind you of a few changes that emerged during that period. So we're switching now from the period of high Maoism to that period much closer to the present day, from the 1980s onwards, when China becomes the workshop of the world, not least off the back of many, many young female migrant laborers. It's often forgotten how gendered the economic miracle in China is. Without many of these young women from the countryside, there would have been no Chinese economic miracle, and that's well worth remembering, I think. A country is in the to tell anyone living in India about this, but nonetheless, it's worth noting that even today, that contrast in China in terms of lifestyle and income between rural and urban remains huge. A society that becomes much more concerned with individual culture, and again, the sort of TV culture of TV talent shows and all this sort of thing emerges. A society utterly transformed in the last few years by becoming so well wired. We now have, I think, last count, something like 600, 700 million Chinese who have some access to is just one example of gaming, obviously multiplayer gaming, but essentially China is a country that these days lives on its phones, and of course is also monitored by its own government through a very interesting company called Huawei, amongst others, which I'm sure you may have heard of in India recently, and which is also part of a much wider set of changes that are being driven by technological capability combined with surveillance government in China itself. Environmental issues, of course, also hugely changing China and becoming, along with India, the United States and Europe, one of the major polluters in the world, but also a country central to the fight to prevent climate change. And also, worth noting, various moments at which China begins to essentially begin that ascent to global power. Very powerful, because of the Beijing Olympics, which you see portrayed there. I think someone else has their microphone open. Could we just get that muted for the moment? I can hear someone else talking in the background. It's some kids or music or playing. Okay, well, I think I'm going to have that sort of Bollywood music in the background until someone works out who it is. So I hope you can hear past the bhangra. Okay, and then the 2008 also, of course, a very important year because it's the year that the great financial crisis really discredits at a huge level the neoliberal consensus, the Washington consensus, we call it, which Beijing fundamentally rejects at that point quite openly. The then Chinese leadership telling people like Hank Paulson, the US Treasury Secretary, Hank, we be your students, but after this financial crisis, what does China really have to learn from you? So, as I say, 2008, an important turning point.
Rana,
And
just
in the
one
midst
second,
of all this, we see the...
Sorry to interrupt, Rana, but
yeah.
I think Shrabani, please advise everybody to switch off their mic. This is very, very, this interruption is quite, okay, I think it's stopped now. So
yeah, lovely. Thanks very much. Whoever that was, turn off their mic. Thank you. Okay. And in that context, which brings us quite close to the present day, we see a real change, at first slow, but then accelerating quite fast in terms of the return of Confucius. Not always explicitly, but in all sorts of different ways. So here we have a picture of former President of China, Hu Jintao, with various young pioneers. And he is the man who brought to Chinese Communist Party discourse the idea of 和谐社会, harmonious society, a phrasing which to anyone reasonably well-versed in history in China, which would certainly include most people going through school, has a very Confucian ring to it. That harmonious idea being used by a communist leader is both accepting the idea of a sort of harmonization, a Confucian idea central to China today, but of course implicitly rejecting the Maoist idea of confrontation during the Cultural Revolution. And it becomes much more explicit than that as well. Statues of Confucius, all of which were pretty much destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, now can be found all over China. And in fact, China's overseas Mandarin language training institutes around the world are known, of course, as I'm sure you know, as Confucius Institutes. Here is a TV show celebrating the birth of Confucius in his birthplace of the city of Qufu in Shandong province in eastern China. And here is a big budget Hong Kong style movie starring a gangster movie hero Chow Yun-fat, in this case playing slightly out of character, playing Confucius in a biopic. a group of Chinese entrepreneurs even decided that they would sort of fight back using Confucius against Western domination by demanding that when Liu Xiaobo, the well-known Chinese dissident, won the Nobel Prize, that he should not have won it, and that the Nobel Prize was discredited. And instead, they set up a Confucius Peace Prize given to alternative winners, one of whom was that well-known lover of peace, Mr. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. So in that particular case, Confucius was being used essentially as a kind of counter to the idea of Western domination when it came to international standards, awards, and so forth. So let me give you my final thought, and then I see that we've got about 20 minutes or so for questions, and I hope we'll move to that. I think it's very instructive to see the rise and then fall in 20th century, and then rise again in the late 20th and early 21st century of the idea of Confucius. Confucius years ago suited the politics of the moment, when it seemed to many young Chinese, not just Mao, but many others, that the severe crisis of imperialism and of economic collapse and of invasion that China was suffering could not be solved with Confucian ideas of harmony and hierarchy and for good or ill, in many cases ill, I think, but people will debate it. China took a very different and radical path in which leadership was essentially about the rejection of that Confucian past. I think today's Communist Party is much more ambivalent about it. On the one hand, they are Marxist-Leninists, and they are people who have inherited and continue to respect much of the legacy that Mao has given them. But they've managed to provide what Marxists would call a kind of mutual contradiction, but a non-antagonistic contradiction, as they would call it, in which Confucius is back also. It's not either or, but as well as. And these elements in which ideas of harmony and of hierarchy and of knowing when to speak out and when not to speak out have become central to the very authoritarian culture that has emerged in China today, in which tradition and Marxist ideas of progress are being brought together very much in the thought of Xi Jinping in particular at the moment, to try and create a new hybrid in which what you might call two of China's most brand name versions of leadership, Confucius and Mao, come together, combine, and then provide something which in some ways is very distinct, but actually quite different from both of those as well. And I hope that might be, Alka, a good point at which I will stop talking at that moment, and perhaps we open up for questions. And I think we have 15, 20 minutes now in which we can take some discussion.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think that was quite a journey you took us on, right from 4,000, 5,000, whatever, many years ago to now. And it's really been quite an amazing snapshot at the way in which, and I particularly like your assessment of China as a plural noun. I think that is something that we all need to begin our study of China with. We're so much habituated to thinking of China now as a monolithic, authoritarian, single ideology dominated kind of a system, that we fail to see that even this ideology, which so-called dominant ideology, is now being opened up in many interesting ways. It's being unpacked. Certainly, it's being very opportunistically manipulated by the leadership in certain directions. So, if we are aware of this kind of a character of the Chinese culture and the strands that have gone to shape thinking, it may help us understand how to interpret statements that are coming out of China today, to see the complexities that are often involved in seemingly very, very anodyne kind of statements. And I think it's important to do that, because we are beginning to, unfortunately, make our discourse very black and white. And what your lecture has done today really is showed us that it's important to see the grays, and I think there are far many more shades of gray which makes the whole picture. So okay, I think we can open it up. I can with a particular question, but I think we are here. Okay, I'm going to try and see how to. So there is one question from. Uh,
Ritu has a couple of questions to ask. Ritu has a couple of questions to
So Dr. is faculty in our center. She has this question on how do you look at the role of Husserl and Liang Chichao in the new culture movement? And so let's combine this because this again is going back into, in a sense, into history. But there's another question which I see, which can bring you to your to the current situation. How do you see the relationship between the politics of Confucius culture as a code of conduct within the existing multicultural society in China? I think you can take this on, these two on.
Okay, yes, I see them also in the chat section, so I'll try and combine those two. Just checking the volume is still clear. You can hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, fine. So I would say that on the second question first about the politics of Confucius culture as a code of conduct within the existing multicultural society in China, I think actually it's a very good question because it gets to the heart of where I think both the problem and the solution might be in contemporary China. The problem I think that China has at the moment organizing its multicultural society is that it talks of multiculturalism, but it finds it very difficult actually to celebrate or to cope with genuine diversity. By which I mean, if you wanted to sort of caricature a little bit, they're very happy for non-Han Chinese groups to sort of wear ethnic costumes and dance on a New Year's TV program for kind of exotic purposes. But in terms of understanding that actually identity is multiple and that people can identify both as Chinese citizens and as ethnic minorities, is something that China finds it much harder to really cope with in that. I would say that the culture, which are essentially about learning, which are about rethinking. One of the things that Confucius said famously was that, at the age of 20, he began to learn. At the age of 40, he would sort of have the glimmerings of understanding. And by 60, he felt that he was sort of ready to understand. That sense that things need to be relearned and reappreciated is something that I think actually Chinese communist political culture could do with a lot more of. But the element that I think is problematic and does come in a sense from the Confucian tradition, not just the Marxist one, is that there tends to be very black and white, 正邪, orthodox, unorthodox division in traditional Confucian thinking. And if something is on the wrong side, then quite often it can be interpreted as having no positive elements whatsoever. And I think the question of ethnic difference, very sadly, in recent weeks, months, and years, has come into that category. So I hope China gets to move away from that. The very historically informed question, I'll try and answer concisely about Hu Shi and Liang Qichao in the New Culture movement. My own feeling is, these are two immensely important figures. Many people will know, but Liang Qichao is probably the single most important Chinese intellectual of the late 19th century, and Hu Shi, one of the movement really in the 1990s. I think that Liang Qichao is essentially a figure who is essential for that moment in the late Qing of bringing in learning from the outside world, not just the West, but also Japan, amongst other places, and setting the ground for what comes. Hu Shi, I think, is actually much more in the center of the movement as it affects the 20th century, because by then Liang Qichao was still around. I think he only died in 1927, but he was a little bit more marginal to the movement by that stage. And I think that if you're going to put one thing at Hu Shi's feet as a major change, which was not Liang Qichao's particular interest, it was the modernization of the Chinese language itself. For those who have learned Baihua, colloquial Chinese, Hu Shi is not the only figure who helped to make that conversion to modernization of the language, but he was very central to it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Chinese, the Chinese language is as it is today, and it's the version that we learn when we learn Chinese. So I think one was a successor to the other in a sense. I'll go to the next question.
Yeah. So, so we've got now something which is related to the first question. So I'll bring up. Okay, now I think
Sure.
this is something that is bothering a lot of people. So you might as well take this. Is communist China using Confucius image now to cover up its muscular policy? Just take that on.
Sure. So the answer is at some level, clearly Confucian language is being used to give a cover of a kind of moral definition to Chinese policy when the actual policy is very realist in the sense of international relations, the use of power and its application. I mean, one might argue just for a moment that many, many societies over decades and centuries have provided a very attractive looking ideological cover for a policy that is essentially about exercising powers. And as China is growing more powerful, it's not necessarily acting any differently from many other growing powers over the centuries. But just to take a couple of seconds on the Chinese case in particular, I think it is worth saying that there is, I think, an element, not the whole of it, but an element of what China is doing with Confucian language that is not just about covering up, to use the question, I say it's a question from Prakash, about covering up. It's also about something that's more complex and more difficult, which is China defining to itself what its moral mission is in the world. And again, Indian specialists in IR, which is many of the people in this conversation I know, will recognize this. When Nehru was trying to find a moral position for independent India after 1947 in the world, non-alignment and also the idea of non-interference and mutual cooperation was a very strong part of trying to position India as a cooperative, neutral, but also morally based actor in the wider world. And you can have debates about whether that was entirely successful, but it was certainly a clear position. I think that the Chinese Communist Party today is trying to do something similar by drawing on traditional Chinese thinking. And the international relations scholar Yan Xuetong, who writes a lot in English actually as well, and his books published by Princeton Press are well worth reading, is probably one of the most explicit advocates of drawing on Confucian traditional language to define Chinese foreign policy. And he does it with great skill and great knowledge. You may disagree with his position, but I would certainly recommend reading Yan Xuetong to read about someone who says that it's not just about covering up its muscular policy. It is about a genuine type of moral position, which he says is not a liberal position, it's not a Western position, but it is about ideas like economic development and developing senses of a kind of common community, which has pride in its own achievements. That's really where I think he's looking for that moral base. Okay, next question.
Yeah. So, all right, but let me just take that a bit further, because currently this whole discourse about this aggressive China, and therefore, how do you really bring Confucius into the picture without doing a great deal of injustice to Confucian ideas? But we can bring that in a bit later. I'll take this question from Monica. Of course, Naresh has another question, but I had taken up his question right at the beginning. So let me bring in some others and then come back to Naresh's question. Monica is asking, can you please explain some more on China being a plural noun, having alienated people from their linguistic identity in Tibet, Fujian, Guangzhou, Xinjiang? How plural is today's China? Well, okay, I'll leave it to you.
Yep, sure. No, I mean, I think you made the point, Monica, in your question. The point is not about the Chinese Communist Party, which has a highly monolithic and extremely, I think, narrow view of what Chineseness is, and the reality of China as it's actually lived on the ground. It is linguistically varied. It is ethnically varied. It has a huge variety of different political and social traditions. The debate over Hong Kong at the moment, which has been very much in the news, and here in the UK, it's huge, of course, because of the joint declaration that Britain and China signed in 1984, which is now coming into question. So we're pretty much taking calls on it every single day. Hong Kong is a very, very Chinese place. It is a place that is, it's ethnically Chinese in terms of the majority of its population. It has a Chinese dialect, Cantonese as its natural language of usage. And yet, as we know from repeated demonstrations and political commentary, it is a place that has taken a much more liberal and, how you might call it, sort of radical and lively view of its own political identity compared to what's happened within the mainland of China itself. So there is nothing in China's political DNA, you might put it that way, that prevents that kind of pluralism being there. Taiwan is another very, very good example of a Chinese society politically separated from China. China, of course, claims Taiwan and is making threatening noises about taking it over quite soon if it gets its way. But the control of Taiwan, which has had to come to terms with actually its own legacy of a minority indigenous Aboriginal population, which is not ethnic Chinese, and trying to redefine what Taiwan Chinese identity with those in mind. Another case in which a Chinese society has had to deal with difference. So I'd say the answer to the question is that if you just take the Chinese Communist Party's view top down, then you get a very monolithic view of what identity is. If you look at how Chinese people actually live on the ground, it's much more complex than that.
Yes. Okay, let's go back to Nadesh's question. He wants to know to what extent the Chinese government is able to use the technological transformation vis-a-vis the implementation of Neo-Confucius culture. You want to take?
Yeah, sure. Yeah? Okay, well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I wouldn't have said that in and of itself, technological transformation in China is necessarily the most Confucian element per se. That one of the things that you can do by using technology in China is to spread particular ideas, including linguistic ideas that get into people's heads, propagandizing. So if we think about the way in which a few terms which have a very Confucian feel to them are spread through Chinese Communist Party social apps, which everyone has to have on social media apps, which everyone has to have on their phones. Ideas, as we said before, of harmony, ideas of virtue. That's another one that comes up. 道德, which actually in some ways is quite Taoist as well, but certainly the idea of self-cultivation for the idea of virtue is very Confucian in many ways. It's about basically learning and then developing your sense of identity and self. So you might argue, I think, that the massive growth of the culture of social media in China has also enabled Confucian ideas to spread throughout society in a kind of networked way. And if you just go on Chinese social media and see the number of people talking about these ideas, there's huge numbers of them. It's very simple. I'll actually just literally, since I can do it now, show you this. This book is published by, can we see that there? Princeton University President, a man called Jiang Qing, and it's a book called A Confucian Constitutional Order. This is an unusual, but in some ways quite well-known and influential political thinker in China who argues that China's new constitutional order needs to draw much more, even in a communist society, on Confucius. And that would, of course, include the new technological networks that shape the China of today. So there are real political philosophers and thinkers out there in China right now thinking about these issues and trying to work out how they come together. One other example actually doing, the writing, actually I'll give you the book here. This book by Bai Tongdong, one of the best known philosophers at Fudan University in Shanghai. And it's called, if you can't see, just say it there, Against Political Equality, The Confucian Case. And it's a very provocative title because who's against political equality in this day and age? But Bai Tongdong has written a very smart book in which he argues, yes, he says, I am against equality. The reason for that is because I think it's actually a better way to make China more liberal. And that, in other words, his book actually, I think probably makes the Chinese Communist Party much more cross than a book about democracy, because actually it is the idea of constitutional change and liberal change in China that's much more worrying for the party than I think the idea of democracy as such, which I think they could control if they ever had it. So a lot of the complexities in modern Chinese political thinking need to be understood. Now, as I say, a lot of this work is now available in English and quite accessible. And I would highly recommend reading all of these people to understand how complex the debates are in Chinese political philosophy today and how they bring in Confucianism and combine it with communism in some very, very unexpected ways.
Okay, so
I lost sound. I've lost your sound.
Okay.
You're back.
Now,
you're back.
yes.
Yeah.
So there are three questions which broadly are dealing with soft power, and so just let's take them all together. Basically, whether Confucius is significant in expanding China's soft power outside, and this is related also to whether there are other philosophers who are also contributing to this soft power. And is China really looking at the other philosophers, both for soft power and for this civilizational state framework? So maybe you could take these three together. There's one more, and I think that will be the last one. Let me throw it along with this, because you can, because this also comes up about issues like pluralism, multiculturalism, but this is more to do with the domestic. Do these ideas really affect the political discourse within China, multiculturalism, and does it lead to diversity within the CPC?
Okay, quite a lot there, but I'll try and sort of jam them together into a couple of thoughts. I mean, my honest thought is I don't think Confucian thinking is a very strong part of the way in which China is trying to project itself overseas. Even the Confucius institutes, and I think actually there aren't any in India, maybe one small private one, but it's not a country that's had many. But in the UK we have 5 or 6, I think, and there are some in other countries. They really are just language teaching institutes. The name Confucius is being used as a sort of friendly brand, because calling them the Mao Zedong centers probably wouldn't give the right kind of impression in this day and age. But they don't teach Confucianism. They're not philosophy centers in that sense. So I think it's worth just making that distinction, which is not always clear to people. But actually, I think there's quite a strong understanding that spreading the idea of Confucianism as such wouldn't be very productive, in the sense that you need to have a certain set of, I think, cultural understandings and norms to make it work. I mean, it works quite well in East Asia. You could argue, I think, meaningfully that Korea, Japan, and Vietnam in particular are Confucian societies also, even though they're not part of, China's political control. But beyond that, I think that's tougher to do. So, as I've said briefly, I think the major way in which the Chinese Communist Party actually is trying to define that moral role overseas is through international development, the Belt and Road Initiative, and that's why the so-called debt diplomacy problem, where it turns out that some of the deals aren't as good as they look, is problematic for it. But when talked about at home, if you see the way the Chinese talk about the Belt and Road Initiative to themselves, a large part of it draws on the idea of China as a benevolent actor in the outside world. So you have to, I think, differentiate the internal discourse from the external discourse on that. And perhaps linking to that, the sort of second point about soft power, I think from what I've seen and my experience of talking to many Chinese thinkers on foreign policy, the holy grail really is the idea that China should be able to get this kind of soft power, in Joseph Nye's original sense of being able to persuade other people to do what you want and make them think that they are happy to do it rather than coercing them. And I've said, in China and in Chinese publications and elsewhere many times, to continue to say that I just think that right now, China's political arrangements do not permit the creation of soft power to the outside world. They allow the creation of an economic miracle. They allow the creation of the world's second biggest military, because those are essentially economic achievements. But essentially, because China is still a country run by a top-down organization that is very, very brittle and fragile when it comes to any sort of criticism. You'll see all the backlash over COVID-19 in the last few weeks. A confident country could have dealt with it saying, we disagree with you, but here's why, in a civilized way, rather than screaming and shouting. The so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which I'm sure you've heard about. And by the way, that very aggressive Chinese diplomacy, the Janlang, the wolf warriors, are quite heavily opposed by significant voices in China who are very smart and recognize this as doing China's diplomacy a lot of harm in the wider world. But I wouldn't say that group is the majority. I think right now there's quite a nationalistic tinge to that diplomacy. So all these things, I think, are basically making it very difficult to create the sense of soft power, because there is still a strange combination, and I've said this directly to many Chinese audiences, including from places like the People's Liberation Army. Around the world, in many senses, even now with COVID and before that, many people around the world respect China deeply because of poverty reduction, tech capability, economic miracle, a whole variety of things. But fewer places around the world feel a great sense of affection for China in the way that they feel affection for the United States, or indeed for India, which Bollywood and all sorts of other things have done lots of things to give a good image of. But also because India, to be honest, is not in any meaningful sense, an aggressive international actor in the wider world and isn't perceived as being so, that has actually helped India's soft power a great deal. China has not put itself in that position because it doesn't have the persuasive propositions. I think it was trying with things like TikTok and so forth, and that, of course, has now been wiped from the Indian sphere within the last few days. But even then, I think part of the thing that actually made TikTok successful was that people didn't know it was Chinese or didn't associate it very centrally with China. Whereas, of course, the benefits of America's soft power is that if you wear blue jeans, if you drink Coca-Cola, if you watch Hollywood movies, everyone knows they're American and wants them anyway. And that flip, that ability to switch over, the Japanese have it too as well, to be fair, in many cases. China has just not been able to manage because it's always trying to do it top down. It won't let things emerge bottom up with the kind of risk, the dissent, the difficulty, the awkward questions, all the stuff that makes people excited about stuff. They want to control it from the top. And as I've said many occasions, and will no doubt say again, until they do that, they'll have huge sorts of hard power, but the soft power will be tiny. Okay, Alka?
Yeah, I think we've come. There was one more question from Ritu about the television culture and so on. Would you want to take that on? Because
Okay, briefly do that. So what's the question?
How do you look at television culture replaced by digital technology and community culture?
All I'd say on that is that my understanding is that China, like every other society in the world that I know about, and I think this is true in India too, it's certainly true in Britain, younger people tend to view things through social media platforms, watching television in the classic sense that those of us who are a little older would have done by sitting down and watching a program on a set, is more and more of a pursuit of an older population group and a smaller minority of those, I guess. So I would say that in that sense, China is very much like anywhere else in the world. Digital technology, brief views, social media, videos, all those sorts of things are very much part of the agenda in a dominant way these days. And actually, one of the easiest ways to access for those who read Chinese, Chinese social media is available to anyone in the world. You just have to go on Weibo or any of the big sites and have a look at what's going on there. And even if you don't read a word of Chinese, the images and the pictures and the videos perhaps give you an idea of the liveliness of what's going on. Chinese political discourse is very heavily censored, make no doubt about that whatsoever. But that doesn't mean that people can't say anything. And when it comes to all sorts of issues to do with social change, complaints people have about many aspects of society, actually China's social media sphere is very lively, and it's a good way to dip into it and see what's going on.
Okay, I think we've run through all the questions and we've also come more or less to the end of our time. Any last minute one-liners? If anybody has, here's your chance. Otherwise, forever hold your peace. Okay, so I think we will conclude this first session. Rana, thank you so much. I mean, what emerges from me out of this whole talk has been that China is finding itself in a very, very paradoxical situation. Clearly, it has amassed huge economic clout, and it has obviously started to build its hard power alongside. I mean, that's inevitable that it will come along, but it is failing miserably as far as soft power is concerned. And that is also largely to do with the fact that the discourse is somehow monopolized by the official discourse. One way out is to really expand the way in which we are looking at China by having more people looking at its society, at its culture, its customs, more people looking at, and more people knowing the language, so that they really know that there is a far greater diversity of thinking in China. But unfortunately, the authoritative discourse, the dominant discourse, controlled by the party, and the rather aggressive turn that we are seeing, that seems to just dominate the entire narrative and understanding. You took us back to the May 4th movement and how there was tremendous diversity of ways in which they were actually looking at the Confucian legacy itself. I'm not quite, I don't recall exactly the year, but Kuo-Moro. I read this delightful piece by Kuo-Moro. It was definitely written I think after the May 4th movement was more or less over. But Como wrote this short, delightful, rather naughty piece, I thought, about a meeting between Marx and Confucius. And it ends, that the whole story ends with Marx running away saying, your thought is far more revolutionary than mine. I don't know why you are saying that my thought will be more acceptable to the country. Your thought should be, your thought should be, translated. I think what Komoro was trying to do was trying to find the convergences between Marxism and Confucianism. Whether the Communist Party today is at that juncture, where they are trying to see how they can fit as much of Confucianism into beyond the opportunistic kind of faith, into their current discourse and behavior. It's a challenge. Big challenge. Important thing is what you've managed to bring out is that we need to certainly expand the way in which we are trying to understand China and look at things in a historical perspective. So thank you very much. I'm really has enjoyed it thoroughly. It has been a very refreshing talk, given the kind, as I said, the kind of things that are currently going on. On behalf of the center, I think, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. It's been a huge pleasure, and hope we will all meet again virtually or some other means sooner rather than later. Thanks very much, Alka. Thank you.
We'll see you at the Jaipur Fest, though.
Yes, and do tune in on Saturday to the Jaipur Festival if you have time. It'd be lovely to see you there as well. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.